It was a bustling afternoon at a popular cafe downtown, the kind of place where regulars enjoyed their carefully brewed coffee and newcomers marveled at the inviting decor. The warm aroma of roasted beans mixed with the faint sound of smooth jazz. Baristas hurried behind the counter while customers lingered in animated conversations. Amid the crowd, Greg, the cafe manager, stood behind the counter with an air of superiority. He was known for his sharp tongue and unyielding rules, often crossing the line between authority and arrogance. Greg loved being in control, and his intimidating demeanor made sure no one questioned his way of running things. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Marcus walked in. Dressed in a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase, his presence immediately turned a few heads. There was something magnetic about the man, calm confidence mixed with a quiet sense of authority. But Marcus wasn't here to make an impression. Today was about observing his latest investment incognito. Unbeknownst to anyone, Marcus had recently acquired the cafe chain as part of an expansion project for his growing business empire. This particular location was the first he wanted to visit, but he chose not to announce himself. Instead, he planned to experience the cafe like any other customer to see firsthand how it operated. As Marcus approached the counter, Greg's eyes flicked up, scanning him with a quick, dismissive glance. Dressed sharply and radiating composure, Marcus stood out in the casual, bustling atmosphere. But instead of seeing potential or professionalism, Greg saw something he didn't like. "Good afternoon," Marcus said with a polite smile. "Could I get a cappuccino and a croissant, please?" Greg narrowed his eyes, leaning against the counter with deliberate slowness. His lips curled into a smirk. "I don't think we serve your kind here," he said, his voice low but unmistakably sharp. The cafe went silent. A few heads turned, some customers pretending not to hear while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Marcus's smile faded, replaced with a calm but firm expression. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" Marcus asked, his tone steady. Greg's smirk widened. "You heard me. We're busy today. Maybe try somewhere else." For a moment, Marcus stood still, processing the words. His eyes scanned Greg, not with anger, but with measured observation. Slowly, he placed his briefcase on the counter, never breaking eye contact. "I'd like to speak to the owner," Marcus said firmly. Greg chuckled, folding his arms across his chest. "The owner? Good luck with that. They're not here, and I doubt they'd waste their time on someone like you." Marcus tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a neatly folded document, placing it on the counter. Tapping the header, he revealed the cafe's logo alongside his signature. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding, "I am the owner. And I think we need to have a conversation." Greg's smirk evaporated. His arms dropped to his sides, and the color drained from his face. The silence in the cafe grew heavier, every customer now watching the interaction unfold. Marcus stood patiently, his calm demeanor unshaken, as Greg struggled to form a coherent response. Greg's mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The man he had just dismissed so arrogantly wasn't just another customer. He was the new owner of the entire cafe chain. The weight of every gaze in the room bore down on him, and for the first time his usual smugness faltered. You're the owner?" Greg stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He let the moment hang in the air, giving Greg time to feel the full weight of his words. Then he reached into his briefcase once more, pulling out another document. This one was marked Employee Performance Review, and had Greg's name printed clearly at the top. "Yes, Greg," Marcus said, his tone calm, but laced with authority. "And I have to say, I'm not impressed with what I've seen here today." The customers, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, now openly watched. A young woman near the window whispered to her friend, their eyes wide. An older man sitting at the counter gave a small, approving nod in Marcus's direction. Greg cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Mr. Marcus, there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone shifting to one of desperate politeness. "I didn't mean any disrespect. It's just, we've had some trouble with certain types of customers lately." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Certain types," he repeated, his voice quiet but cutting. Greg swallowed hard, realizing too late the trap he had walked into. I mean, people who cause problems. I didn't mean to imply—" Marcus cut him off, stepping closer to the counter. "Didn't mean to imply what, Greg? Because from where I'm standing, it seems like you meant exactly what you said. And that kind of behavior has no place in my business." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His face turned a deep shade of red as the customers exchanged murmurs of disapproval. Marcus let the silence linger before continuing. "Do you know why I bought this cafe chain, Greg?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. Greg shook his head, his usual bravado replaced with nervousness. "I bought it because I wanted to create a space where everyone feels welcome, a place where people can enjoy their coffee without being judged or mistreated. Clearly that vision doesn't align with how you've been running things here." Greg shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I understand, sir," he said quietly. Marcus wasn't done. Turning to the customers, he raised his voice slightly. "To everyone here, I want to apologize for what you just witnessed. This is not how we do business. This is not the environment I want to foster in my cafe." The room erupted in quiet applause. A few customers nodded in agreement, murmuring words of support. One older woman even spoke up. "Good for you, young man. It's about time someone set things straight." Greg looked like he wanted to disappear, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Greg," he said, turning back to him, "you have two choices. You can leave right now and never come back, or you can stay and make this right, starting with a public apology." Greg's jaw tightened, his pride warring with his fear of losing his job. Finally he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll make it right." "Louder," Marcus said firmly. "If you're going to apologize, do it properly." Greg looked around the room, his humiliation evident. Taking a deep breath, he raised his voice. "I'm sorry. To everyone here, I'm sorry for my behavior. It was wrong, and it won't happen again." The apology was met with more scattered applause. Marcus nodded, satisfied for now, but his expression made it clear that this wasn't the end of the conversation. "Apologizing is a start," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "But actions speak louder than words. Starting tomorrow, you'll undergo mandatory sensitivity training, and your performance will be closely monitored. One more incident like this, and you're out." Greg nodded quickly, eager to salvage what little dignity he had left. "Understood," he said quietly. Marcus turned back to the customers, his tone softening. "Thank you all for your patience. I promise you this cafe will be a place where everyone feels welcome." As the room began to settle back into its usual rhythm, Marcus stepped aside, allowing the next customer to approach the counter. Greg retreated to the back of the cafe, his usual arrogance replaced with a humbled demeanor. As the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Greg stood frozen in the back, his mind racing. The humiliation he had just endured played on a loop, but more than that, he couldn't shake the truth in Marcus's words. For years he had run the cafe with little regard for anyone who didn't fit his narrow expectations. He told himself it was about keeping order, but deep down, Greg knew it was something far uglier. Leaning against the storage shelf, Greg allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He thought back to his upbringing, where his father had drilled a harsh worldview into him. "Respect is earned, not given," his father used to say, often with a sneer when someone different moved into their neighborhood. Greg had never questioned it. He'd simply absorbed it. And now, for the first time, he was questioning everything. Meanwhile, Marcus sat down at a table near the window, sipping his cappuccino and watching the cafe's activity with a discerning eye. He wasn't a man to humiliate others without cause, but he also believed in accountability. His thoughts drifted to why he had purchased the cafe chain in the first place. For Marcus, this wasn't just business, it was personal. Growing up, he had spent many afternoons in cafes, sketching plans and dreaming of a future where he could build something meaningful. But too often, he'd been met with the same dismissive attitude Greg had displayed today. He'd been ignored, spoken down to, and sometimes outright denied service. Those experiences had left a mark, but instead of succumbing to bitterness, Marcus had vowed to create spaces where everyone felt valued. Marcus watched as Greg reappeared from the back, his steps hesitant, and his gaze downcast. There was no trace of the smugness from earlier. For a moment Marcus considered letting him go, but something stopped him. He saw potential in Greg, not in the man he was, but in the man he could become. "Greg," Marcus called out, motioning for him to come over. The cafe quieted slightly as Greg approached the table, his posture stiff and uncertain. "Yes, sir?" Greg asked, his voice subdued. Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down, let's talk." Greg hesitated but eventually complied, lowering himself into the chair like a scolded child. Marcus leaned forward, his tone measured but firm. "I want to understand something," Marcus began. "Why did you think it was okay to treat me or anyone the way you did today?" Greg's eyes darted to the table, his hands fidgeting. I don't know," he admitted after a long pause. "I guess I thought I was keeping the place under control, making sure everything ran smoothly." "And you think excluding people is the way to achieve that?" Marcus asked, his gaze unyielding. Greg shook his head quickly. Not really. It's how I was raised, I guess. My father always said—" He trailed off, realizing how feeble the excuse sounded. Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Greg, I'm not interested in excuses. I'm interested in solutions. You've been given a second chance, a rare opportunity to learn and grow. What are you going to do with it?" Greg looked up, his expression one of genuine regret. "I want to make it right," he said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out." Marcus nodded, satisfied for now. "Good, because this cafe isn't just about coffee, it's about community. If you're serious about changing, you'll start seeing it that way too." Greg stood, a little more sure of himself now. "Thank you," he said earnestly, "for giving me another chance." As Greg walked away, Marcus couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. People could change, he believed that. And maybe, just maybe, Greg would prove it. As the tension in the cafe began to settle, customers started murmuring among themselves. The events they had just witnessed weren't something they'd easily forget. Many exchanged approving glances, impressed by Marcus's calm authority and the way he handled the situation. An older woman sitting near the counter leaned toward Marcus as he stood. "You handled that beautifully," she said with a warm smile. "It's about time someone put people like him in their place." Marcus smiled back, appreciating her support. "Thank you. It's not just about putting someone in their place, though. It's about building something better." The woman nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you've got my vote of confidence. I've been coming to this cafe for years, but it's clear things need to change." Others began chiming in, their voices rising with encouragement. A young barista who had been quietly observing from behind the counter stepped forward. Her name tag read Emma, and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Marcus," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've seen Greg treat people like that before, but I never felt like I could say anything. Today, you showed us that things can be different." Marcus's expression softened. "Emma, you're part of this team. If you see something wrong, I want you to feel empowered to speak up. This cafe belongs to everyone who walks through those doors, and that includes you." Emma smiled, her confidence growing. "I'll do my best." The community's support wasn't just limited to words. Over the next hour, as the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, customers made an effort to engage with the staff more warmly. Conversations buzzed about Marcus's vision for the business and the kind of leader he appeared to be. Later that evening, after the cafe had closed and the last customer had left, Marcus gathered the staff together for a meeting. The group stood in a loose circle, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. "I want to thank all of you for your hard work," Marcus began, his voice steady. "I know today was unusual, to say the least, but it was also a chance for us to reflect on what we want this cafe to represent." He paused, scanning the room. "I didn't buy this chain just to sell coffee. I bought it because I believe in the power of community. A cafe should be a place where everyone feels welcome, a place where people from all walks of life can connect. That's the kind of environment I want to create here." The staff nodded, their expressions thoughtful. Marcus continued, his tone growing more resolute. "But creating that environment requires all of us to do our part. That means treating every customer with respect, speaking up when something isn't right, and holding each other accountable. We can't change the world overnight, but we can start by making this cafe a better place." Greg, who had been standing at the back of the group, shifted uncomfortably. Sensing the moment, Marcus turned to him. "Greg," Marcus said, "you have an important role to play in this too. I meant what I said earlier. You have a second chance. But you'll need to prove you deserve it. Sensitivity training starts tomorrow, and I expect you to take it seriously. This isn't just about keeping your job, it's about becoming a better leader." Greg nodded, his gaze downcast. "I understand, sir. I'll do whatever it takes." Marcus nodded in return, satisfied for now. "Good. Because this cafe, and every other location in this chain, needs leaders who embody the values we're building. Let's set an example for others to follow." As the meeting ended and the staff began to leave, Marcus stayed behind, sitting alone at one of the tables. He gazed out the window at the quiet street, his thoughts drifting. This was only the beginning, he knew that. Changing a culture, even in something as small as a cafe, would take time and effort. But today had been a start, a reminder of why he had taken this leap in the first place. If he could transform one cafe, one staff member, one customer at a time, perhaps the ripple effect would go further than he could imagine. Emma walked over, breaking his thoughts. "Thank you again for everything today," she said quietly. "It feels like things are already different." Marcus smiled. "That's the goal, Emma. One step at a time." As she left, Marcus looked around the cafe, imagining the possibilities. The hum of the coffee grinder, the warmth of the atmosphere, and the murmur of happy conversations, it was all within reach, and he was determined to make it happen. As the meeting ended and the staff began to leave, Marcus stayed behind, sitting alone at one of the tables. He gazed out the window at the quiet street, his thoughts drifting. This was only the beginning, he knew that. Changing a culture, even in something as small as a cafe, would take time and effort. But today had been a start, a reminder of why he had taken this leap in the first place. If he could transform one cafe, one staff member, one customer at a time, perhaps the ripple effect would go further than he could imagine. Emma walked over, breaking his thoughts. "Thank you again for everything today," she said quietly. "It feels like things are already different." Marcus smiled. "That's the goal, Emma. One step at a time." As she left, Marcus looked around the cafe, imagining the possibilities. The hum of the coffee grinder, the warmth of the atmosphere, and the murmur of happy conversations. It was all within reach, and he was determined to make it happen. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the cafe early. The sun was just rising, casting a golden glow over the storefront. Inside, the baristas were already setting up for the day. Greg was there too, standing quietly in the corner, waiting for Marcus's instructions. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus greeted, his voice calm but energized. "Today marks a fresh start. Let's make it a good one." The staff responded with nods and smiles, a noticeable shift in their attitudes since yesterday's events. The tension that had once lingered in the cafe seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a sense of hope and renewal. Marcus walked over to Greg, who was nervously clutching a notepad. "Greg," Marcus said, his tone measured, "I need you to shadow Emma today. She's going to show you how to handle customer service properly." Greg blinked, clearly surprised. "Emma?" he repeated, glancing at the younger barista who had barely spoken up before yesterday. "That's right," Marcus confirmed. "Emma has a way of connecting with customers that this cafe needs. Watch, learn, and ask questions. Today is about growth." Emma looked both proud and nervous, but nodded firmly. "I'll do my best," she said. As the cafe opened for the day, Greg followed Emma closely, observing her interactions with customers. She greeted everyone warmly, her genuine smile setting the tone for each exchange. When a customer expressed dissatisfaction with their order, Emma handled it gracefully, offering a quick solution and a free pastry as an apology. Greg found himself surprised by how natural it all seemed. He had always approached the job with a rigid, rule-bound mindset, believing that authority was the only way to maintain order. But watching Emma, he began to understand that connection and kindness were far more effective. By midday, Greg was starting to step out of his comfort zone. Under Emma's guidance, he greeted a group of customers himself. Though his voice was hesitant at first, he managed to smile and engage with them in a way that felt genuine. Marcus observed from a distance, nodding with quiet approval. During a brief lull in the afternoon rush, Marcus gathered the team for a quick meeting. Standing at the center of the cafe, he addressed the staff with a tone that was both inspiring and firm. "I've been watching all of you today," Marcus began, "and I want to say I'm proud of the effort you've put in. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. This cafe isn't just a place to sell coffee. It's a place to build connections, to welcome everyone, and to make people feel valued." He turned to Greg, who stood near the back of the group. "Greg, I've seen you step up today. That's a good start. Keep going. You have the potential to lead, but only if you commit to this new vision." Greg nodded, his expression more confident than it had been that morning. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." Marcus's gaze swept over the rest of the team. "The same goes for all of you. This isn't just my vision, it's ours. Together we can make this cafe something special." Over the next few weeks, Marcus's influence began to transform the cafe. Customers noticed the change almost immediately. The staff was friendlier, the atmosphere warmer, and the overall experience more inviting. Word spread quickly, and soon the cafe was busier than ever. Greg, in particular, underwent a noticeable transformation. Though his old habits didn't disappear overnight, he worked hard to change. Under Emma's mentorship and Marcus's guidance, he began to embody the values the cafe stood for. For the first time in years, he felt pride in his work. Not the pride of authority, but the pride of building something meaningful. One day, a regular customer approached Marcus as he sat by the window, reviewing plans for another cafe location. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "This place feels different now. Better. You've made a real difference." Marcus smiled, his gaze drifting to the bustling cafe around him. "That's the goal," he replied. "One step at a time." As the cafe thrived, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It wasn't just about one cafe or one manager. It was about creating a ripple effect. Every small change, every step toward inclusivity and kindness had the potential to inspire something greater. Greg's transformation wasn't just a personal victory. It was proof that people could change when given the chance. And as Marcus prepared to leave the cafe that evening, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was more than a business. It was a mission. Standing at the door, Marcus turned to take one last look at the cafe before stepping outside. The hum of laughter, conversation, and the clinking of cups filled the air, a sound that promised a brighter future.